Sophie had always imagined a future full of love and laughter with her husband, Jack. They had built a life together, one that seemed invincible, filled with hopes of growing old together and raising a family. When Sophie found out she was expecting twins, her joy knew no bounds. Jack was thrilled, and the two of them had begun to dream about the future they would give their children. The house was soon filled with the buzz of preparations, the nursery, the baby clothes, the excitement of new beginnings. Sophie felt like everything was falling into place. But that all changed in an instant. It was a quiet afternoon when Sophie received the call. Jack had been out running errands, as usual, but this time the phone rang with a voice she didn't recognize. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the voice said, her words cold and distant, "but your husband has been in an accident. He didn't make it." At first, Sophie couldn't comprehend the words. She thought there had been some mistake. Jack couldn't be dead. He was just out buying groceries. He couldn't be gone. But the truth hit her like a bolt of lightning. There was no body, no closure, just the painful confirmation that Jack was no longer in this world. Sophie collapsed onto the floor of their living room, her body trembling with shock. Her mind screamed for a reason, for some explanation that would make sense of the cruel twist of fate. But no such explanation came. In the days that followed, Sophie was surrounded by sympathy and condolences, but they all felt hollow. Jack's funeral was a blur, and the silence that followed his death was suffocating. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her, and she was left alone, pregnant with twins and suddenly without the man who had promised to stand by her side through it all. The authorities had no answers. They simply handed her a death certificate and left her to pick up the shattered pieces of her life. As Sophie sat alone in the dark of their home, her heart ached with the cruel reality that the man she had loved was gone forever. Life after Jack's death was a never-ending battle. Sophie felt as though she were drowning. The grief she carried was compounded by the crushing weight of her financial struggles. As she moved through each day in a haze of exhaustion, debt collectors began knocking on her door. Bills piled up, and the simple act of keeping food on the table became an overwhelming challenge. Sophie had always trusted Jack to handle their finances, and now she realized that he had left her with more than just emotional scars. The debts he had accumulated were astronomical, and Sophie had no idea how to begin to dig herself out of the hole he had left behind. With the twins growing inside her, Sophie knew she couldn't afford to sit idle. She took on multiple jobs, working as a waitress at a local diner by day and cleaning houses by night. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, and the emotional toll was even greater. Every day, she fought to keep her head above water, but the debt kept mounting, and her once peaceful life was reduced to a series of frantic efforts just to survive. She could no longer afford to stay in their home, so she sold the furniture, took a smaller apartment, and started over from scratch. She worked tirelessly, but no matter how much she earned, it felt as though the debt was insurmountable. Every time the phone rang, she braced herself for another demand from creditors. Yet, Sophie refused to give up. Her children, her precious twins, were her reason to keep going. She would not let their future be defined by the mistakes of a man who had abandoned them both, physically and financially. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, was for them. But in the quiet moments, when she could steal a breath between shifts, Sophie felt the weight of Jack's betrayal like an anchor around her heart. He had promised her forever, but he had taken that promise with him. She didn't know how she was going to move forward, but she knew one thing. She had to keep going for her children. As much as the pain threatened to consume her, Sophie kept fighting. The days bled into one another for Sophie, each one marked by a relentless struggle to keep afloat in a sea of debt and despair. But as the months passed, she clung to a flicker of hope, an opportunity to escape it all. One rainy evening, a flyer slipped through her door, advertising a job on a cruise ship. They were looking for waitstaff, offering room and board, and the promise of better wages than Sophie had ever seen. She stared at the flyer for a long time, unsure whether to trust it. Could it really be the escape she so desperately needed? Could it give her the chance to provide a better future for her children? The thought of leaving her unborn twins behind for months at a time filled Sophie with guilt, but she knew it was the only option. The mounting debts weren't going to disappear on their own, and the small apartment she had rented would only remain a temporary solution unless she made drastic changes. The cruise ship represented freedom, a world beyond the suffocating confines of her current life, and Sophie had no choice but to take a chance. The day she boarded the ship was a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The grandeur of the ship was awe-inspiring, like a floating city, but Sophie felt small in comparison to the opulence that surrounded her. Her uniform was simple, nothing like the elegant attire of the passengers, but she couldn't have cared less. All that mattered was that this could be her way out, her chance to rebuild. As she settled into her small cabin and began her duties as a waitress, Sophie allowed herself to feel a spark of hope for the first time in years. The work was grueling, the hours long, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that she was working towards something greater. Each tip she received was a step closer to freedom, and each day that passed brought her closer to the dream of a better life for her children. But no matter how much she focused on her work, her thoughts often drifted back to the twins she had left behind. She missed them more than words could express, but she reminded herself that this sacrifice was for them, for their future. In the evenings, as the sun set over the vast ocean and the passengers dined in luxurious restaurants, Sophie found herself imagining the life she hoped to build. A life without the crushing weight of debt, a life where her children would never have to struggle as she had. She couldn't help but dream of their faces, Jacob and Lily, growing up in a world where they would want for nothing. She had no idea how long it would take to reach that future, but for the first time in years, she believed it was possible. It was on a quiet afternoon when Sophie's entire world shifted again, just when she thought she had found a sense of peace. The cruise ship was nearing a tropical port, and Sophie was working the lunch shift in one of the ship's upscale restaurants. The restaurant was bustling with passengers, all chatting and laughing as they dined. But Sophie's attention was split between taking orders and keeping up with the demands of her customers. It wasn't until she walked to a table near the window that her world suddenly stopped. There, sitting across from a stunning woman dressed in a glamorous evening gown, was a man who stopped her in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But there, staring back at her, was Jack. Sophie froze. The sound of the bustling restaurant faded into the background as she stared at the man who had supposedly died 7 years ago. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Jack couldn't be alive. She had buried him. She had mourned him. She had carried on alone, raising their children without him. And yet, here he was, alive, sitting at a table, eating a meal like nothing had ever happened. Her pulse began to race, her thoughts spiraling in every direction. She knew she had to confront him. She couldn't let him get away again. But her legs felt like jelly, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Was this some cruel joke? Was it really him? She approached the table slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to know. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a whisper, barely audible above the clinking of silverware. Jack? His face went pale at the sound of her voice, his eyes widening with shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the years hanging between them. The woman at the table watched them, her expression confused, but Sophie's gaze was fixed on Jack. She saw the guilt in his eyes. Guilt and something else, something she couldn't quite place. Jack stood up slowly, his face contorted with a mix of panic and remorse. Sophie, I never thought I'd see you again. The words hit her like a slap. You never thought you'd see me again? Sophie's voice cracked with emotion, her anger rising. You left me. You faked your death and left me to raise our children alone. Do you have any idea what I've been through? The hell I've lived because of you? Jack's face twisted in discomfort, but there was no apology in his eyes. I didn't want to, Sophie. I didn't have a choice. I was in too deep. My debts, they were going to destroy us both. I had to disappear. Sophie's heart shattered as the truth sank in. Jack hadn't died in an accident. He hadn't been taken from her in a tragic, unforeseen way. No, Jack had left her. He had chosen to abandon her and their children, leaving her to bear the burden of their debts and the weight of the lies he had woven. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had faked his death and vanished without a trace. Sophie's hands trembled with rage, the years of pain and betrayal rushing back to the surface. You think that's a good enough reason? To leave me alone, to suffer, to raise our kids without you? Her voice was rising now, drawing the attention of the other diners, but she didn't care. She was too consumed by the anger coursing through her veins. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie didn't give him a chance. She turned on her heel and stormed away, her breath coming in short gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. Her world had shattered once again. But this time, there was no mourning, no silence. This time, there was only fury, and a plan beginning to form in the depths of her mind. Jack would not get away with this. He would pay. Sophie stormed out of the restaurant, her mind whirling, the anger within her flaring like wildfire. The air outside was warm, the ocean breeze gently lapping at the side of the ship, but Sophie felt none of it. The world around her felt cold, distant, as though she were trapped in a nightmare. She walked quickly, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet hallway, her heart pounding with fury and disbelief. How could he do this to her? How could Jack, the man she had loved with all her heart, the father of her children, betray her so completely? The years of pain, of struggling alone, of raising their twins without him, flashed before her eyes like an unforgiving film. The memory of her grief, of the loneliness, of the overwhelming weight of the debts he had left behind. It all crashed into her in that moment, making her feel as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Sophie didn't know how long she walked before she found herself on the deck of the cruise ship, leaning against the railing as the sea stretched endlessly before her. The gentle waves, the sound of the water crashing against the ship's hull, offered no comfort. Her mind was consumed by the image of Jack sitting at that table, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. It made her sick to her stomach. She could hear his voice again in her mind, the hollow apology, the half-hearted explanation. He hadn't just disappeared to save her from debts. He had run away to escape his responsibilities. He had left her to fend for herself while he lived his life in secret. Sophie's hands clenched into fists as her anger swelled. But there was something else inside her, something darker. Betrayal had a way of awakening a thirst for justice, for retribution, and Sophie knew in that moment that she wouldn't let Jack off the hook. He had taken so much from her, from their children. Now it was time for him to pay. She stood there for a long time, the weight of the decision settling over her like a heavy cloak. She couldn't just walk away. She couldn't let this man, the one who had stolen 7 years of her life, escape with nothing but his guilt and the comfort of his new life. No, Sophie had suffered too much for that. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. The world was about to change. The next morning, Sophie awoke with a sense of clarity that surprised her. The fog of grief and confusion had lifted, replaced by a sharp, focused determination. She had made up her mind. Jack wasn't going to get away with this. He had ruined her life, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. She quickly showered and dressed, her mind racing with possibilities. Sophie knew she couldn't just confront Jack again, demand answers, and hope for some kind of closure. No, this needed to be more calculated, more precise. She had to make him pay, not just for the pain he had caused her, but for the lives he had destroyed in his reckless pursuit of escape. Sophie's anger had morphed into a plan, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of power. As a waitress on a luxury cruise ship, Sophie had been privy to many conversations. She had overheard whispers in the lounge, snippets of stories told over cocktails, and, more importantly, she had observed the passengers who came and went. She had learned quickly who held the power, who controlled the wealth. But one thing had caught her attention the most. A group of men who had been frequently mentioned in hushed tones, the same men Jack had once owed money to. They were criminals, dangerous people, and they had a reputation for getting what they wanted, no matter the cost. Sophie had always kept a distance from the darker elements of the ship's clientele. But now, she realized that these men could be her ticket to justice. If she could use them, she could not only expose Jack's fraudulent activities, but also bring him to his knees. She didn't have much, but she had information, details about Jack's fake identity, his debts, the things he had done to disappear from her life. Sophie had no illusions about what she was about to do. This wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be clean, but it was necessary for herself, for her children, and for every moment she had spent wondering why Jack had abandoned her. Over the next few days, Sophie made discreet inquiries. She found the right contact, a man who worked in the lower levels of the ship, one who had access to sensitive information. She took a deep breath before approaching him, her pulse quickening. The man's eyes flickered with curiosity as Sophie spoke in low tones, outlining her plan. She offered him everything she had, the evidence of Jack's new identity, his involvement in illegal activities, the name of the group he owed money to. In exchange, Sophie made it clear that she wanted one thing: Jack's downfall. She wanted him to face the consequences of his actions, every last one of them. The man was wary at first, but Sophie was persuasive. She knew exactly what to say. She had a deep well of pain and anger to draw from, and she used it to her advantage. She spoke of how Jack had destroyed her, how he had left her to raise their children alone while he hid behind a false identity. Slowly, the man agreed to help her. Sophie's heart raced as the first part of her plan fell into place. Now, all she had to do was wait. The wheels were in motion. Jack was about to lose everything. As the days passed, Sophie kept a watchful eye on Jack. She knew he would never suspect what was coming. He thought he had one. But Sophie was about to prove him wrong. She would take back control, and she would make sure Jack paid for every moment of pain he had caused her. The ship, once a symbol of escape, was now the stage for her revenge. And she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Sophie's plan was set into motion. With the contact's help, she had gathered everything she needed: Jack's fraudulent identity, the bank records, and most importantly, proof of his ties to the criminal organization that had once controlled his life. She felt a cold, calculated sense of resolve as she watched the days pass, each one bringing her closer to her moment of reckoning. The idea of revenge had long since left her. Now, it was about something much more important: justice. The ship was docked in a port, its hull glinting in the sunlight as passengers disembarked for their excursions. Sophie stood in the small staff room, her mind racing through the steps of her plan. She had made contact with the enforcers of the criminal group, sending them the evidence she had meticulously collected. It was a simple offer: expose Jack, and she would give them everything they needed to bring him down. In return, they would keep her safe. She wasn't naive enough to think they would do it out of the kindness of their hearts, but it was a calculated gamble. If she played her cards right, Sophie could leverage this criminal organization to not only destroy Jack's new life, but to protect her own. The response had been quick. The enforcers had made it clear that they were interested in her offer, but they needed proof: solid, irrefutable evidence. Sophie had delivered. With a steady hand, she had forwarded all the crucial documents: bank statements showing fraudulent transactions, contracts signed in Jack's name, and a list of debts far greater than she had ever known. As the digital files sent their way, Sophie knew that this was no longer a simple game of revenge. It was about survival, her survival, and, most importantly, the survival of her children. As Sophie stood on the deck of the ship later that evening, the cool wind tousling her hair, she couldn't help but think of the moment she had walked into that restaurant and seen Jack again. The anger had been so fierce, so immediate, that she hadn't been able to process the enormity of what was happening. But now, standing there, knowing that her actions were leading to a great unraveling, Sophie felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, she wasn't just a victim. She was in control. The phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her contact. The enforcers had received the evidence, and things were about to move. She could almost feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of a long-awaited storm. Sophie's hands clenched as she read the text. Jack's already feeling the heat. He won't last much longer. She knew that the final confrontation was coming, and she was ready. It would be her moment to take back everything that had been stolen from her. She had walked through years of hell to get to this point, and she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The next day dawned with a chilling sense of inevitability. The cruise ship was docked at a private port, a quiet destination that would serve as the backdrop for Sophie's final showdown with Jack. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ship's decks as Sophie made her way to the staff area, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. There would be no turning back now. Sophie had been following Jack's every move for the past few days, watching from the shadows as he made his way through the ship, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing around him. She knew that he had no idea what was coming. His world, built on lies and deceit, was about to collapse, and Sophie was the one who had set the pieces in motion. She received another message, this time from her contact within the criminal organization. They're coming for him. Sophie's pulse quickened. She knew what this meant. The enforcers had found Jack, and they were closing in. With a deep breath, Sophie steeled herself. She had already alerted the authorities on the ship, just in case things went too far. But she wasn't expecting a clean resolution. No, she knew this would be messy. Jack wasn't going to go down without a fight. Sophie made her way toward the VIP suites, her mind sharp, her body tense. The enforcers were waiting for her signal, and she was determined to make sure Jack couldn't escape. She passed the familiar hallways, the opulent doors that led to the luxurious rooms where the wealthy passengers stayed, now feeling like a prison to her. Jack had lived in this bubble of comfort, while she had fought for survival in the harshest of conditions. Now, it was time to tear it all down. As Sophie rounded the corner to Jack's suite, she saw two of the enforcers standing at the door, their expressions unreadable. One of them gave her a slight nod, and she knew that the moment was at hand. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she walked up to the door. She could hear voices from within. Jack's voice, low and urgent, as if trying to negotiate with someone. But it was too late for negotiation. Sophie stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly as she knocked on the door. Jack's voice fell silent immediately, and for a moment, there was only the sound of her own breath, shallow and fast. The doors swung open, and Jack stood there, looking as composed as ever, too composed, like a man who knew nothing of the storm gathering around him. When he saw Sophie standing there, his eyes widened with a mix of fear and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat when he saw the two men standing behind her. The enforcers. Sophie. Jack's voice was a whisper, filled with uncertainty. What is this? Sophie didn't answer. She stepped aside, and the enforcers moved past her, entering the suite with swift efficiency. Jack tried to back away, his eyes darting between the men and Sophie, but it was too late. The truth had caught up with him. As the enforcers closed in, Sophie felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was what she had worked for, the culmination of years of pain, anger, and betrayal. Jack was finally facing the consequences of his actions. She could see the fear in his eyes now, the realization that his past had caught up with him. "You thought you could run," Sophie said, her voice steady but cold. "But you can't outrun the damage you've done. Not anymore." Jack opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. His fate had been sealed. The enforcers moved quickly, their businesslike efficiency, leaving no room for mercy. Sophie watched as Jack was escorted out of the suite, his expression one of shock, his body tense with fear. But for Sophie, it was finally over. The ship, once a symbol of escape, now stood as the arena where she had taken back control of her life. As Jack was led away, Sophie allowed herself to breathe again, knowing that she had finally reclaimed her power. Her revenge wasn't sweet, it was just. And that, Sophie realized, was all that mattered. Sophie stood on the deck of the ship, watching the horizon. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but it felt as though a new chapter in her life had already begun. Jack, the man she had once trusted with everything, was now just a memory. His betrayal had cost her so much, years of pain, countless sleepless nights, and a battle she had never asked for. But now, Sophie felt an unfamiliar weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she could breathe freely. The enforcers had done their job. Jack was in custody, taken off the ship in handcuffs, escorted by the authorities, his life now a shattered mirror of what it once was. The luxury, the wealth, the false identity, none of it mattered anymore. Jack's world had crumbled, and Sophie had made sure that he wouldn't escape this time. The debt he owed, both to her and to the people he had wronged, was finally being paid. But it wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about Sophie and her children. She had spent so long fighting, surviving, trying to keep their lives intact while battling the ghosts of her past. Now, for the first time, Sophie felt like she was walking into a future of her own design. The future she had always dreamed of, one where she could give her children everything they deserved. The burden of Jack's betrayal had clouded every decision she had made, but now that fog had lifted. The cruise was about to dock at its final destination, and Sophie's heart raced with anticipation. It had been a long time since she had felt hope, since she had allowed herself to dream of a life beyond the wreckage of her marriage. But as the ship slowly approached the port, Sophie's thoughts turned to the two little souls waiting for her at home. Jacob and Lily, her twins. They had been her anchor, her reason for everything. And now, they would no longer have to grow up in the shadow of Jack's lies. As the ship finally docked, Sophie gathered her things and headed to the exit. She wasn't sure what awaited her on the other side, but she knew one thing for sure. This was her new beginning. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, Sophie felt ready to face it. She could see her children's smiling faces in her mind, hear their laughter echoing in her heart. She couldn't wait to hold them, to wrap them in her arms and tell them that their mother had fought for them, had fought for their future. The past no longer had a hold on her. Sophie was no longer the woman trapped in the pain of betrayal and loss. She was free, and as she stepped off the ship and onto the solid ground of the port, she knew that her life, her real life, was finally beginning. The warmth of home greeted Sophie as she stepped through the door. It was a simple moment, one she had dreamed of for years, but it felt like a miracle. The sight of her children, Jacob and Lily, running toward her with wide smiles on their faces, was enough to make her heart swell with gratitude. The world outside had been full of chaos and betrayal, but this, their home, was where Sophie found peace. "Mommy!" Lily cried, throwing her arms around Sophie's legs. Jacob followed close behind, his small hands grabbing at her as though he couldn't believe she was finally home. Sophie bent down, pulling them both into her arms, the weight of the past 7 years lifting off her shoulders as she held them close. It had been a long, painful road to this moment, but Sophie realized now that every step had led her here, back to her children, back to a life filled with hope and possibility. She had been broken, yes, but she had rebuilt herself from the ground up. The man who had once been the love of her life was no longer a threat. His lies, his betrayals, they were no longer a shadow over her. Sophie sat on the couch, her children snuggled up beside her as they chatted excitedly about their day. The simple joy of being with them, of watching them grow, was all she had ever wanted. The future felt uncertain, yes, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was the here and now, the love and warmth she shared with her children. That was her foundation, her reason to keep going, and everything else could fall into place. As the evening wore on, Sophie found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about the moment she had seen Jack again on the cruise, the flood of emotions that had followed. Anger, betrayal, a need for justice, and in the end, she had found it. Jack had paid for his actions, and she had taken back her life. But more than that, Sophie had found a deep sense of inner peace. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, afraid of what might come next. She wasn't carrying the weight of Jack's sins on her back anymore. She was free. Her children's laughter filled the house, and Sophie smiled. They were happy. They were safe. And that was all that mattered. The ghosts of the past might never fully disappear, but Sophie had learned how to live with them, how to move forward despite them. She had rebuilt herself into someone stronger, someone who could protect her family, someone who could finally breathe easy. The future, Sophie realized, wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind, abandoned and broken. She was a mother, a survivor, and a woman who had reclaimed her power. And in that, Sophie found peace. A peace that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, knowing that no matter what came next, she had already won. Her heart swelled as Jacob and Lily snuggled closer, their faces filled with love and trust. They had been through so much together, and now they were finally free. For the first time in a long while, Sophie could let herself believe in a future filled with hope. Sophie stood in the doorway of her children's room, watching them sleep peacefully, the soft glow from the nightlight casting a tender light across their innocent faces. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had not known in years, when pain and betrayal had always overshadowed her life. But now, everything had changed. She was no longer the woman left behind, no longer the one crushed by the mistakes of the past. Sophie had stood tall, found herself again, and protected what mattered most, her children. The long days of sorrow were over. She had reclaimed her freedom, her peace, the life she had always deserved. Jack, the man who had once been everything to her, was now just a chapter in the past, a book closed. And Sophie knew that while the scars of her journey might never fully heal, she had learned to live with them, to move forward in spite of them. They were no longer burdens but reminders of her strength, of a woman who refused to be broken. As Sophie walked into her bedroom, her heart swelled as she thought of Jacob and Lily, safely asleep in their beds. They had been through so much, but now they were free. The future no longer frightened Sophie. It held endless possibilities. She was no longer the woman haunted by fear and betrayal. She was a mother, a survivor, a woman who had taken control of her own destiny. The path ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but Sophie was no longer afraid. She had learned that the past didn't define her. What mattered was now. What mattered was the love she shared with her children and the life they would build together. She had faced darkness and emerged stronger, and she knew now that whatever came next, she was ready. As she gently closed the door to their room, Sophie smiled to herself. She had already won. She had reclaimed her life, her future, and her peace. With her children by her side, the possibilities for tomorrow were endless. The journey had been long, but it had led her here, to a place of love, hope, and freedom. Sophie had found her way home, and that was all that mattered. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey and listening to Sophie's story. I truly appreciate you taking the time to dive into this narrative, experiencing every twist and turn with me. Your support means the world, and I'm so glad you were part of this adventure. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any future stories. Your feedback and support keep me motivated to create more content like this, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Once again, thank you for being here. Until next time, take care and stay tuned for more.